nothing upsets the world and the world of food, health, nutrition more than my opinions on sugar, which aren't so much opinions on exactly what sugar does and how healthy it is, but it's kind of on our attitudes, because I think we have a really strange relationship with sugar in terms of diet and health. It's kind of completely demonised, and I think most people, including me, would accept that almost all of us in the UK certainly eat too much sugar and should probably cut down. But my worry is that always translates into sugar is evil, addictive, and the most poisonous substance known to man, and more poisonous than alcohol or cocaine, or and that's not hyperbole. There are plenty of articles out there which will say exactly that. So that's the problem I have with sugar. I have a problem that it's kind of felt to be a uniquely harmful, dangerous substance, and I think that's missing a huge amount of nuance, but also just making people feel very guilty about how they currently eat, because we all eat a certain amount of sugar. And with that, roughly chime in what you said. I know you might have slightly different views, but I think probably
I completely agree with that. I think absolutely, I completely agree with that. I think there's a lot of people who are very fearful around sugar. And actually we know from sort of psychological research actually that when people completely try and restrict their sugar intake on these sort of detoxes, or completely cutting sugar from their diet, sugar detoxes, what tends to happen psychologically is that actually we crave sugar. So obviously that's then going to look like an addiction, because you're craving something, but actually you're starving your body. Your brain will only really wants to use sugar as a substrate. So as soon as you completely cut carbs out of your diet, then obviously your body has to work a lot harder to try and feed your brain. So you put everything into disarray. So yes, whilst we all probably do need to watch our free sugar intake, there are different types of sugars, we all need to watch our free sugar intake a little bit, but actually only within reason. And generally the people who are completely cutting sugar and doing sugar detoxes aren't necessarily the people that need to be watching their sugar intake. So it's again about everything in a balance, and looking at ways that you can reduce your sugar, but also actually how can you enjoy your food more? Can you make it so that you're not craving sugar because you're not restricting it completely? So you're allowing yourself some of these foods that maybe are higher in sugar. So then, and I see this all the time clinically. As soon as I say to somebody, no, you are actually allowed to eat these foods. This is okay. You can eat chocolate. This is an okay thing to do. They then eat it in balanced amounts with other foods, not only chocolate.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot of things you just mentioned there. But one thing you said, which I very much agree with, is that sugar's not an addictive drug.
No, I think, absolutely.
Yeah. And I think that there's a lot of people, you'll see it all over the place that sugar is addictive, as addictive as cocaine. I can talk about that particular study, why that's rubbish. But and it lights up the pleasure centres of the brain when you eat it. Well, anything that you enjoy doing lights up the pleasure centres. That's literally what the pleasure centres of the brain are. And it's sweet things are nice, and I think we all know that. So it's not exactly a revolution for people to say that. But I mean, I think this thing about addiction is interesting, because if sugar was an addictive substance, then sugar addicts would be eating sugar out of a bag of sugar. It's interesting you mentioned chocolate, which people say, oh, I'm cutting out sugar, I'm going to cut out chocolate. Well, that's fine. If you want to cut out chocolate, fine. I wouldn't recommend it, because chocolate is nice. And chocolate has sugar in, but it has a lot of other stuff in as well. Chocolate has a lot of fat in it as well. And it's quite sort of calorie dense, and it's those sort of things which are quite calorie dense and highly palatable, which perhaps might produce some sort of addiction-like behaviour. But I don't think officially there is any category of food addiction which is a genuine clinical addiction. No,
absolutely not.
So
I think there's an emotional sort of attachment to food, which is in some, in a lot of cases normal, because actually we don't eat solely for nutrients. We eat because it's enjoyable and whatever. But I know, for a lot of people, for example, since childhood have been told, well, if you eat your vegetables, then you get your dessert, which tends to be more sugary. Or if you fall over, you get consoled by having a chocolate bar or an ice lolly to cheer you up. So there's a lot of emotional attachment to food, I think. And I think that's more for some people than others. And so I guess that's, just being aware of yourself and aware of why you're eating, and going, okay, well, it's normal for me to eat emotionally sometimes, because actually we're human and that's what we do. But if that's happening all the time, then that's
I think there are
not necessarily great.
Those sort of the emotional drive can override simple normal hunger and satiety signals, and that kind of produces an addiction-like behaviour. But I think the evidence is that that's linked to kind of particularly emotionally resonant foods, certainly not to specific ingredients.
No, absolutely not.
I don't think any food has that sort of addiction-like behaviour. The interesting thing about, I think I mentioned before, the study that shows that sugar is more addictive than cocaine. There was a study about, literally, I don't know where they dreamt this up. I presume it was a university night out, but they decided to do an experiment to test whether rats preferred sugar or cocaine. So that study does exist, and it has been done, and it's cited so often, not in the scientific literature, but in the popular literature. There's an interesting point about that study, which is often missed, which is that the rats only had this addictive behaviour towards sugar when it was given intermittently. If they had constant access to sugar, then it didn't have the addiction-like behaviour. It was that intermittent. And rats and humans are different, obviously, but there are similarities in the way we process food and react to food. But I think that's a really interesting point, because it's that sort of intermittent, and it comes back to something you said earlier about how people denying themselves food. Now, in a modern food environment, the thing we're told is bad about the modern food environment is we all have access to as much as we want all the time. But the only time you get that sort of intermittent access would be in a situation where you're restricting food in some way for a period of time and then allowing yourself to eat it. And so perhaps, I've got no evidence apart from this one study, which I often insult actually, but perhaps there's something in that. Perhaps it's kind of this intermittent access you're getting to food rather than that sort of constant access. And even if it is, it's not ingredient specific. There were other similar studies on rats where they had addiction-like behaviours to other sort of calorie-dense type foods, like chocolate and that sort of thing. I worry about us focusing too much on one ingredient. I think it's quite harmful for people's relationship with food. It makes them feel very guilty, because sugar's in a lot of stuff, and it's in a lot of fruit, and you will see on the internet plenty of people saying don't eat fruit, because it's got sugar in it. It's just like candy.
Whereas actually, Whereas actually, the sugar in fruit is bound within the fibre, and so actually we don't really get much of that sugar that comes from the fruit. So.
Yeah, and fruits have a lot of micronutrients, and they have a lot of fibre, and they have a lot of other good reasons to eat them. Yeah. And people are kind of cutting it out of their diet because the sugar, which I think is a really harmful thing. Yeah. But having said that, we have both said, and we both agree, most people eat too much sugar. Yeah,
too much of the free sugars that we can cut down. That our bodies don't need too much of it. We need the sugars that are in fruits, we need the sugars that are in dairy products. There's another natural sugar in dairy called lactose, so we need those. But we can definitely all probably cut down a little bit on the other free sugars.
Yeah, I think that's fair enough, and I think there's no danger in putting that information out there, but it always gets twisted into this sort of problematic discourse of saying cut it out. I think because as a chef, I'm someone who says, well, I don't want anyone to cut any food out if they enjoy it. I want people to get pleasure out of food, and a lot of delicious things you make. I was a pastry chef for sort of 5 years, and I made delicious desserts and all these things with huge amounts of sugar in, frightening amounts, lots of fat and cream and butter as well. But I don't want anyone to be sort of fearful of sweet foods. and I want people to enjoy eating lots of different foods. But when I see people who are maybe, there are plenty of people in the UK, certainly a sort of slightly younger age groups as well, who get 25-30% of their calories from sugar. And for me, that's not a diet of enjoyment. That's a diet which is very, very restricted. And I always worry when people are really restricting their diet, partly because you're missing out on loads of other stuff.
Yeah.
Just missing out on loads of other flavour and taste and that sort of thing, but missing out on other nutrients and micronutrients and fibre and all those things. So I really worry when people restrict their diet to so much sugar. So I don't think it's too conflicting for me to say we should enjoy eating nice food and not feel guilty about it when it's sweet and has quite high sugar content, but we should also be eating less sugar as a population.
Yeah, absolutely.
Or as individuals often.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, I mean, on the course particularly, obviously you give lots of information about sugar and dispel some of the myths, some of the stuff like some of the stuff we've been talking about now, and some other sort of interesting facts. I mean, a little bit on how eating too much sugar is harmful. I mean, is that fair to say? Expand on that at all?
Yeah. So in terms of we know the World Health Organization have kind of set the levels of this is how much sugar maximum that we should all be having of free sugar. So it should be around 5% or less energy in our diet. And that's on the basis of dental caries, which I think is often not talked about actually in popular literature. The free sugars going in can really increase dental problems and problems with our teeth.
Yeah, which can have a massive impact on other areas of health as well.
Yeah,
can't
absolutely.
It?
Because if your teeth aren't okay, you can't actually eat all the healthy foods. Fibre is quite difficult to eat with no teeth. And also in terms of sort of maintaining healthy weights as well. But again, it's not vilifying one nutrient. And I think this is what you have to be quite careful of, because yes, we want to keep sugars, 5% or under in terms of energy intake, but also we need to look at all the other balance of the diet. So it's not only sugar, and the World Health Organization is not only setting limits for sugar. It's just that that's sort of pulled out and gone, oh, okay, well this sugar must be the bad guy. And it's like, actually, no, it's better to think in terms of, okay, let's look at the overall balance and see what we can do. And also, taking the guilt away from food, I think, is an enormous part of this as well. And the sessions certainly touch on that, because actually, if you remove the guilt from somebody eating something, they then can just eat it and not then go on and sort of that mentality of on a diet, off a diet, so if you allow somebody to have something, they then go, oh, okay, well, that was nice, and they don't have to feel guilty about it. And anecdotally, but with all of my clinical patients in this situation, if they eat a chocolate bar and they feel like they're not allowed it, they'll then go and eat 10 more chocolate bars. Whereas actually, if they eat a chocolate bar and feel like that was nice, I enjoyed that was okay, and I was allowed to eat that, then you can change that whole after behaviour. Like, they don't do that next part,
it's an
which is really
interesting thing about our culture, isn't it? That we have this sort of guilt associations around food. There's a very famous food psychology study by a guy called Paul Rosen who took two different populations, one in America who had quite high levels of poor diets and high levels of diet-related disease, and a population in France who ate quite well and were quite healthy. So two separate populations, and he just basically showed them images and recorded their reactions. And he shows them an image of a really nice-looking chocolate cake, and asked people to say what the first phrases and thoughts that come into their mind when talking about this chocolate cake. And in America, obviously, it's probably for a lot of people in the UK actually, the first one was guilt, because I feel guilty about eating that. In France, it was celebration, and I think that there's an interesting. I mean, France has probably shifted since, because this study was a while ago. But there's a really interesting difference in the cultures between the two groups, which show that. And I just very firmly believe that this guilt about food is one of the big problems we have.
Yeah, absolutely.
I mean, as part in terms of the recipes and stuff we do in this part, it's obviously slightly different to some of the others, because we're not, we don't want to be saying people cut sugar out your diet. Here's a load of sugar-free recipes. We look at the way sugar gets used in a lot of products and recipes, and looking at ways you can sort of reduce that consumption to an extent, with just some sort of cooking tips to help improve the flavour without necessarily adding lots of sugar and loading on sweetness. We also talk about, it's a slightly contentious point, but in terms of things you might use to replace sugar, which are sometimes actually cooking techniques rather than just like sugar, like sweetener or whatever. Which is interesting, because a lot of the time you'll see, and I'm sure you see this a lot, people recommending sugar replacers, which are just basically other forms of sugar, like agave syrup and rice syrup and those sort of things.
Just because they sound posher doesn't necessarily mean that they're any different. There's something about that sort of sugar, which is actually another interesting point, which comes from some research Paul was that sugar and water and salt are the only three pure things we eat. It's very purified, and I think there's a certain psychology about that sort of purity being perhaps sort of forbidden in some way. Interesting psychology about it. But those sort of syrups and things feel more natural, and they feel like they should be healthier. And actually, a lot of the people selling, I won't name names, I should do, but I won't. I have written about them. A lot of people selling sugar-free diets then go on and sell these sugar replacers, which are just things which are different forms of sugar, which are just like 20 times more expensive than real sugar. So we won't be recommending any of them, but we will be showing a few tips to how you can have sort of nice, satisfying, healthy, varied, interesting diet, and perhaps some tips to cutting down the amount of sugar you eat.